name is Purdeep Sangha. I'm a husband. I'm a father of two little ones. I got an 11-year-old and soon to be a 9-year-old, entrepreneur in multiple different sectors. But my biggest passion is really helping other people. That's been something that I've been doing since I was 16 years old, and then got into personal training and I was coaching and all through the corporate world, and then started my own advisory firms. And one of them is really focused on helping men in particular. So we help men in basically all aspects of their life. We help them perform better, not only as business leaders, but as husbands, as fathers, as members of the community. So we have this I talk about the three frameworks, and I have the book The Complete Man, but it's really how do you perform at your best, how do you achieve your best, but also how do you be fulfilled in all areas of your life. So those are the things that we focus on, and I'm happy to be talking about this topic because more than ever, especially coming out of COVID, I know that guys need the help. And there's more and more guys that I'm talking to that have mental health challenges and just struggling in different areas and relationship challenges and some even with substance abuse and addiction. So it's a timely topic to really bring to the forefront.
I will agree. And I think there's some people out there that still believe that mental health is more like a gendered issue. They still think it only impacts women, where a lot of men suffer from mental health because suicide is highest among men. And there's a lot of health issues related to the mind and not only on the emotional side that impact men. So, from your standpoint, when you're working with these men, what are some of the challenges that they're facing um, in the world today? Let's start there.
Okay, well, yeah, there's a number of challenges. One is it's almost frowned upon to be a man these days and a strong man and masculinity. So that's the biggest challenge right now. I would say there's a level of confusion for guys that are even under 60. And so I think the 60 plus age still has that old school mentality a little bit. Anybody under has been raised kind of, it really started in the 60s movement, right? Where this feminist movement really shifted people's perception. So I would say, yeah, that's roughly about the right timing where people under 60 have been influenced under this. And then I would say mainly even the youngest generation right now, the new, guy or little boys that are being raised right now, they have no clue what it means to be a man and masculinity. And so I have an 11-year-old boy. I'm very, how do I say, careful in terms of how I raise my son and my daughter. So I'm trying not to put as much pressure on them, but I also know based on the science, and we can talk about that today in the biology, that and what they're teaching in school. If I don't teach them how to be boys, my son to be a boy and my girl to be a girl, no one's going to teach them that in society. It's going to be really like a neutral state. So that's one of the biggest challenges is guys are confused in terms of their role in society, their role in relationships, and their role as a father. Now you put on a whole other layer on it, which is um, we are facing a huge pandemic when it comes to mental health, particularly, I believe, and we've done a lot of research in different areas, not necessarily this, but technology, particularly smartphones, have impacted relationships and they've impacted men as well. So here, let's give a practical example. I'm sitting here on the couch with my wife, and she's scrolling on Instagram, right? So now, rather than us actually connecting with each other, that attention is going somewhere. Or let's just say my wife's sitting there and I'm scrolling on YouTube or whatever that is. So that is happening in relationships. So men and women are becoming more disconnected, or whoever you're in a relationship with, right? So that disconnection is happening, and more men are feeling discontent and unsatisfied in their relationships. So that's another element that's impacting them. Now you even have in the corporate world where men it's almost frowned upon. And this is interesting. The middle-aged white guy, I almost feel sorry for them because it's almost frowned upon to be them these days because they're almost on like a hit list, right? Like guys that have honestly worked their butts off and worked hard to be in that position. Now they're being stereotyped as the middle-aged white guy. They got the job because he's white. So that stuff is blowing stuff out of the water too. And so we have this whole situation. And then you add the stuff that's been coming in from the US. I know you probably have US listeners, but this whole polarity, man, is really driving society into a different direction. And that's impacting us in Canada here now. We're seeing it in our own politics between the liberals and conservatives, right? You got the liberals doing their own thing, and then you got the conservatives that are just it's like they're almost like the Republicans, no offense. And I'm not for or against anybody, but it's almost like let's just tear down the other guy and that's going to be our platform. And so we have this happening in masculinity as well. So there's a lot of things that we could talk about here, but that's kind of a breakdown in terms of where we are in society for men. Is we really need a lot of help, and I think one of the areas is mentorship and having these open conversations.
I remember reading a report where it touched on the dynamic between the relationships, let's say 20, 30 years ago, and as you mentioned recently. And they put it to the smartphone. And it was interesting to see that you had a man and a woman, I'm using a heterosexual relationship, how many hours they spent connecting with each other and how many hours they spent on their phone scrolling, as you mentioned. And
Yep.
there's an imbalance. They spend more time on their phone connecting with people that are relatively strangers to them versus
Yep.
their own partner who they live with. And then you take into the fact that, let's say, sexually suggestive images and videos, right? And then that triggers something, especially in young men's minds, where it's like, okay, I want more than that. I want more than that. I want more than that, right? It becomes like an addiction to them. So now they have this skewed view of what their women should be. Now, on the other side, you have women developing this expectation of men from what they see online, not knowing that that isn't reality, that's fantasy. And I
Yeah. Yeah.
think sometimes you have it comes across as this old school term of like the conditioning of the mind, where
Yes.
they don't know how to separate the two. And then you made another really good point where there's some people who are growing up not knowing what their role in the world is. And I think a lot of times that's still based on your sex. Like a man has a specific role in the world and a woman has a specific role in the world. But now the lines have been blurred, and you have women saying that I can do everything a man can do, but then when you pull up the jobs that are the most dangerous, the most outside, the long distances is mostly male dominated. And then when you look at the ones that are more indoors, more nurturing, it's more women dominated. So it's interesting to see how we can say the world is one way, but to your point, when we look at the numbers, it actually shows no, it's still this way and it's been this way for many, many years. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. I think you said a lot there in those sentences. So let's just break down the first part. I completely agree with you. I think we've overlooked a number of areas, which is basic biology, right? And that's something that we haven't. We as men are bigger in physical stature and size for a particular reason, right? We are built to be dominant from that perspective. We are built to be driven. We are built to take charge. And that's no offense to any women out there, but I think there's a misunderstanding. I'll give you a prime example. There's a huge drive for women to be CEOs, and I think they should be. I think absolutely they should be if that's their aspiration. But I also know many of those women who are burning out at a faster rate who don't necessarily have the same level. I'm talking about a resilience, right? And tenacity. And sometimes it takes that in specific roles. And I'm not saying women are not suited to do that. I'm just saying what ends up happening though is then it knocks them out of their natural balance. And so these women don't feel like they don't have that femininity side to them anymore. They feel like they're losing that. They feel like they're not in touch with themselves, right? Whereas where you talk to men, when they are dominant, they are in touch with themselves. So there's a natural biology and psychology there that we've ignored. We're also taking a look at, and I think there's a food challenge there in terms of what we intake and the pesticides and quality food and hormones. But if you take a look at infertility rates, it's increasing in both men and women, right? So women are having a tougher time getting pregnant, and some of that has to do with men as well. But their fertility rates are being challenged right now. And why is that? Because women are having children later. They're more stressed out, right? And I feel sorry for women because there's a lot of pressure on them to be professionals, to be everything to do with a mom and take care of the house. So there's a lot of pressure on them as well. I believe, if you take a look at people in their natural states, one of my old spiritual mentors said this, and it was really interesting. He said, our time started with men hunting and bringing home meat and women making soup. And he said, our time will end going back to men hunting and bringing home meat and women making soup because that's our natural spiritual biology. And one is not better than the other. That's the other thing too. I think we've lost touch that. Since when do men and women need to compete? Like, what's going on here? We should be complementing each other. That's the beauty of it. I'll give you something that I've been learning myself, even though this is the work that I've been doing, is my wife and I just recently took up dancing together. So my wife has used to salsa dance before we got married. And then when we got married, she stopped doing it. I guess you can't really do that when you're married and go and dance with other guys, right? But I said, I'm a secure guy, but and I'll learn or whatever that is. But then we had kids and then I actually said, you know what, I'll start taking dance lessons. Let's do this, right? Because I know it was important to you, but I'll start doing this. But there's something phenomenal that I learned. And that is when you are dancing as whether mask, let's just say a man or a woman, because that even saying that for some people feels like that's wrong, right? Some people will degrade and say, why are you saying man and woman? Why can't you just keep it neutral? But in this case, I'm going to say because 90% of relationships are heterosexual, I'm going to say man and woman. If you're dancing with your woman, the man is the leader in the dance. And that's what they will teach you. The male teachers, the instructors will teach you that. The female instructors will teach you that. And they will teach you as a man, you need to be a strong leader. If you're not a strong leader, it's going to be hard for the woman to follow you and for you guys to be in step and in sync. And the females will even say that too. They'll like they teach my wife, you got to be a good follower. You got to understand and look for the lead so that way you can dance to your tune. And when we dance, the funny thing is it's all about making the woman look good. We're just there kind of like the pole, right? We're just there to kind of lead. But the woman is the one that's doing all the fancy moves and looking good. No one really looks at the guys, right? But there's a huge lesson that I learned there, which was the whole leading and the following aspect and the natural, you can say, energies and how they combine, because that is the dance for us in life. And we've lost that balance. And when I am not a good leader, we don't dance well. If my wife is not a good follower and she tries to lead, we don't dance well. So that's a real practical example of where we are in society these days, where it's just simple biology, but also the psychology of how we work. When you put two people together, typically one is more of the leader than the other, right? And there's nothing wrong with that.
I wonder if they're trying to maybe rewrite the psychology of it because they can't undo the biology, right? The biology is for those who are into computers, that's like the hardware, right? It's
Yep.
written. Um, so I want sorry, that's more of the software and it's written inside and it's coded. But everything else, essentially, maybe you can change it. Maybe you can change the psychology of someone to say, hey, I'm in the workforce just as long as Purdeep, just as long as Terrain. I'm naturally going to be competing for the next promotion, the next raise. So if I'm in competition professionally, at what point does it translate or transfer over to your romantic and your personal life? There's a reason
Yeah.
why they will say that the higher a woman climbs, the less successful she's in her romantic life, her dating, her marriage. So I'm wondering if there's maybe that connection where they say, okay, I can follow, but I'm having children later, I'm getting married later. So I'm spending more time in a role of having to provide for myself and be in competition with other men. And then I've been doing it for so long now. When I'm ready to be led by a man, I can't find someone,
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
wonder if that's the thinking now. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, yeah. I think you're bang on because my colleagues in the space of relationship psychology, that is one of the biggest factors that they're seeing. Feminine women in their 20s and 30s are having a tough time finding masculine men these days. And so there's a big epidemic that's happening on that side. But I completely agree. There's nothing to say that women are not successful in the workforce and sometimes way more successful than men, right? That's just the nature of the beast. It's when we translate that to our relationship. So if they need to be dominant at work and they're trying to and they use that same psychology and bring it home, it's not going to work for them and it's not going to work for the man in their life. Like my wife is a prime example. She's very educated, has multiple degrees, has a great career, but she says openly herself, I don't want to be this driven. Like I'm making a great career and stuff like that, but she's like, no, I'm losing my femininity. I don't want to work and be driven like this. Like This isn't her natural side. So it really comes down to how do you feel that is your natural state? And I think if you talk to a lot of people, they cannot connect with their natural state these days. And that's a challenge. And for men in particular, because they don't know what their natural state is. I grew up on an orchard doing physically hard work, right? You grew up, I'm sure, in an environment where it was, there's some work and physically hard work involved, or men are men, but that is not happening these days. And so we know what that's like, and the younger generation doesn't know what that's like. So to go back to your point in terms of biology versus psychology, yes, people are using the psychology card, and I'm sure that it can work to a certain degree, but it's backfiring. Here's another practical example. When men are the primary caregivers of small children, infant children, their testosterone drops by up to 40%. What does that mean? It means that their testosterone is a key, um, you can say, hormone for men. It's important for their sex drive. It's important for their mental and physical well-being. It's important for their muscle mass retention. And so when we start to lose that, we actually lose a big part of our masculinity. So there's nothing to say that men shouldn't be the primary caretakers, but men have to be aware. If I'm staying at home raising my kid, I need to do something to offset that. I need to go out there and hit the weights or the punching bag or play sports or do things with a guy so I can raise my level of testosterone. So that goes against the biology part, right? Raising infants as men, it's something that we can do, but we're not biologically designed to be the primary caregiver, right? And here's why. People say, well, what's wrong with that? At 40%, your testosterone drops. If we take a look at it from an evolutionary perspective, if our testosterone dropped by 40%, let's just say 100,000 years ago, right? If our testosterone dropped by 40% and I'm protecting the child, and another man comes into my domain that has more testosterone and bigger physical muscle mass than I do, I'm not going to be able to protect my kids. So it's not natural, right? So there's that whole biology there. So hopefully that makes sense. I think if I can sum it up, people, both men and women, are having a tough time finding their natural state because we are using psychology now as a way of shifting people's behavior and trying to pigeonhole them. And I don't even know who's doing this or what the agenda is, or if people are just jumping on the bandwagon or doing it based on not being educated fully or just retaliation. I think that's the other thing that we're seeing too. People are just spewing stuff because they don't like to hear what the other side is saying. So just in argument, they'll go to the polar opposite other end and talk a bunch of nonsense. And that's the challenge that we have today.
I think another reason why they probably do that, to your point, is they can weaponize it if they wanted to, right? They couldn't say to, let's say, myself or yourself, saying that we're going to change your biology. Like, we don't have the means to do that at the moment completely, right? You can transition into from a man to a woman and vice versa. But the core of who you are, what makes up your biology, is still going to be the same. And there's one person that mentioned when they had a conversation about like the different genders and stuff like that versus sex. They said that if you were to die and 100 years later they dig up your body, you'd be identified as a man, regardless of what you felt like at that point in time, right? So when I see people using the psychology, I think that's what it is, because you can say it in a way that I feel like this, I feel like that. Where when it's like biology, it's more so you are this. Here's why. You are that. And here's why. So from the men, what would be their role to stand up and maybe assert themselves? Because if, and I remember coming across that report as well, where their testosterone decreases when they're taking care of children very young. If that goes for a prolonged period of time, we're going to have a generation of men that's going to have very low testosterone because they're doing things that are against them naturally. And then you may have another group of men who are very dominant because their testosterone has always remained high. So, what can men do to ensure that they're staying true to themselves and true to their natural state?
Yeah. Okay. So that's a loaded question here and a really good one. So the first thing is I would highly recommend for whatever age the man is to find a good mentor. Find a mentor who's in his natural state. in a good relationship is successful from the perspective of maybe financially successful, whatever that looks like, right? But you want to find those men that are in, you can say, in their natural state, that are good in their own shoes and their own skin. They feel good in their own skin. I was thinking about this morning train is, there's some guys, and there's nothing wrong with this, right? Like, don't get me wrong. Style is awesome. Spending money on shoes and jackets and clothes and suits is awesome. But there's something that I learned that my grandfather taught me. This is the old saying. It's the man that makes the clothes. It's not the clothes that make the man. And we have to understand that. Do we feel good in our own skin? So one of the things that we have to figure out is, do we feel good in our own skin? And a lot of men don't. So surround yourself with other men that feel good in their own skin. And you can tell when people are faking it and when they're not, because when they're faking it, they're putting on a persona, right? And you can see right through that. So find mentors. I think that's one of the key things that we can do, and we've lost touch with that. The other one is look out for elders and the wisdom from elders, because find someone who's in their 60s, 70s, 80s and learn from them. I wish my dad was still around, right? He passed away at 64. I wish my grandfather was still around because they taught me core principles of being a man. And I wish I could still learn from more from them. So that's another one. Physical work is another aspect. We have to get back into doing physical work as men, because sitting at a desk or doing, you know, cognitive tasks is great, but we are designed to do physical work. So we have to get out there, whether that's, and I'm not talking about sport. I think sport is great, and I think everybody should. I'm not talking about exercise, because exercise is important. I'm talking out there, going out there and doing something, whether it's cutting the grass, building a fence, building a deck, whatever you need to do to get out there and do some old school physical work, because that's going to bring us back to our roots there. Um, Brain, I think the other one is actually educating ourselves on masculinity, educating ourselves on biology, right? Because it's hard. The first point for men to be able to change is to understand what masculinity is and understand that it's okay to be masculine. And it's not necessarily in today's society, it's not easy to do that because we're getting mixed messages. And so getting awareness of what it means to be a man through old school books, I think Stoicism is great, because if you take a look at some of the old books from Meditations of Marcus Aurelius or other books from the olden day ages, um, there's a lot of learnings in there for men in particular, a lot of learnings. And philosophy, this is something that I brought back into my life because my grandfather introduced it to me, and then I brought it back about 15 years ago. Is philosophy is such a powerful thing for men. It's a way of living. And when we go back to how the ancient times were, a lot of that stuff still applies. Like, know thyself. We've forgotten about that. Know thyself, right? And how do we know thyself unless we actually, um, this is kind of an offshoot, but we society used to have rituals for boys to become men. And sometimes those rituals were not necessarily, I'm going to say, healthy. Some of them were probably downright primal, but there was a passage for boys to become men and to say to themselves, they've taken another journey. I don't see that passage anymore, right? We don't have really anything in society that enables boys to become men. It's just kind of like boys still stay boys. So, I'm going to stop there and I'm going to open it up because I'm sure you got tons of wisdom to share here as well.
I think the passage one is a fantastic recommendation because there has to be something that you have to accomplish, right? It doesn't have to be like a physical test. I'm not talking about like back in the days where you had to do the trials of Hercules, for example, right?
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking is that when you're put in the position, let's say in Canada here, it's mostly 18, 19, right? Let's say at the age of 19, and you get your community together, right? Which is something we definitely have to bring back. And you say that I am a man, and you proclaim it to your community of men, community of mentors, elders. This is why I'm a man. And you list your accomplishments. I'm a man because of this. I'm a man because of this. I'm a man because of this. And you have other men, 60, 70, 30, 40, cheering you on because some of your accomplishments were their accomplishments when they're your age. I think if we can do something like that, not only will a young man feel proud, he has the support of his community, and it's a proclamation. And then, of course, you're going to have women who are going to be around and other people's going to be around, and they're going to be cheering this person on. I don't think there's a celebration into manhood anymore. And I don't even think people understand what manhood is. Like, you go online, you hear everything that manhood and masculinity isn't,
Yeah.
right? Oh, you're a masculine man, you must beat your wife. You must want her to be barefoot and pregnant in the kitchen. You must want her doing the laundry. She never sees outdoors. She has no friends. Was there a time when that happened? Absolutely. Is that what we're talking about? No. Right? But what we want is the celebration. Are you taking care of the woman you have at home? Are you making sure she's safe? Are you making sure she's secure? If there's noise in the middle of the night, are you the one to go down there, or are you telling her to go down there? Right? Because that does happen sometimes these days, right? So that's where I think we have to get back to, because you raised a really good point where it's important to remember how things were and take the very best of it, right? So if you now had an opportunity to create your passage for men, what would it be?
Oh, that's a really, really good question. Man, let me think about that because I think that's a powerful, powerful question. So if I'm talking, I like to use the concept of the Renaissance man because that for me is phenomenal. That's something that when I was young, that's something that I learned. That's one of the first things. I think I was in grade six. I had a substitute teacher. He said, "Go look up Leonardo da Vinci and these great inventors." And that whole era was about Renaissance men, men that could do it all, or at least attempt to do it all, right? Balanced men. So for me, that's what it would be. So a passage in terms of what have you done intellectually, right? That enables you to be a man. What have you done spiritually that enables you to be a man? Maybe it's artistically that enables you to be a man. So I think there's different factors depending on your group or whatever, I think different groups, or you can call them clans, will have different approaches. So whatever is appropriate to yours, I think that's what you use and you come up with criteria for that. I think men should be balanced. I think boys need to understand, A, what is it like to play on a sports team and be competitive? Right? Not just an individual thing. So, for example, my son's playing piano, but he's also in soccer, right? So I want him to learn the instrument, but I also want him to learn how to play in a team and be in a hierarchy and work his way into and earn his way into certain positions and spots, right? And be held accountable. So I think that's what I would do. I would say, hey, look, if it's a bunch of guys my age, I'd say, hey, guys, let's come up with some categories and say, what should our sons, what are the key categories that we think that they should be taken into? Considering this one factor, though, Train, is that we also have to nurture their natural beings, right? And so that's the other thing. We can't pigeonhole them, but I think if we nurture their a natural state and allow and actually push them to be a little bit more balanced, I think that's important. And here's what I mean by natural state. Maybe, maybe, for example, my son is not meant to be a great sports athlete on a sports team. Maybe he's meant to be a great individual sports athlete. So maybe golf is better for him, or maybe something else. So we need to nurture our children's natural state as well. But I think that is a powerful question that you just asked. You made me think here and think hard. But when I come back to it, for me, I always gravitate towards a Renaissance man because for me, my wife is always like, "How do you know how to do that?" And it's not that I know how to do that. I'm like, I just attempted to do it. Maybe I haven't done it at all, or I've learned something from the past and I've attempted to do something in the past and I've learned from it. I've made mistakes. So I build things, I build decks, I build stuff from wood. I know how to garden. I know those kinds of things. I can't do everything, but I know how to do a lot of stuff that is useful. Whether it's trying to learn an instrument. But I come back to that. So let me come back to the core part, which is, the Renaissance piece. Let's get our boys to be more balanced and learn different aspects of life rather than sitting on the computer and just playing video games.
Do you think part of that passage could be finding out what you're not good at and then
Oh,
pivoting?
oh, I think that, yeah, I think that's an amazing point there. Because just as we are gifted with something, we are not gifted in other areas. So I think that's important. I think regardless of whether that's a passage or not, I think that should be a core part of the teaching system, the learning system that we have, the academic system that we have. We don't do that. And I think we have to take that into our own hands as parents. So we have to understand, A, like you said, yeah, what are they really good at? And B, what can they be good at? Because here's what we do as parents, and this is what the research shows, that if we put our kids into something that we like, what ends up happening is those kids will tend to be good at that because we put them in that sport or activity and we put the time and energy into it. Not necessarily that they have a natural talent in that particular area. It's because we've given them the time, energy, and effort and discipline to put them into that type of activity. So it's interesting how we think that our kids are good at something, but it's because we've put them in that, right? And so I think we have to rethink that. And I don't know what the tool is for young kids right now. I don't know what's available. That's an interesting one to take a look into in terms of how do you identify their skill set.
I wonder if it's because they're doing it because there is a reward that they know is at the end. So, as a parent, you put your child into something that you will enjoy. They're doing it out of the love for their parents if they're close enough to it. Even if they don't like it, there's a lot of things that I participated in. Like as a child, I remember my parents putting into spelling bee championships, right?
Well, yep.
And it was tough. It was tough because it wasn't something that I necessarily enjoy. Now, fast forward 20 years later, I'm in my 30s, 25 years later, I love words and I love the English language and I love learning, finding out new words. There was points in my time where I would read the dictionary. So that was something that my parents, who they were both university graduates, they loved um, education and the masters and mastering words wasn't something I really enjoyed, but because I wanted to do it and make them proud at that time, it showed up later on in something that I love to do. And when I look back on that, and we're both from Canada, and you mentioned when we talked about um, boys, especially being allowed to fail in our education system, they're not allowed to fail. Everyone gets passed, everyone gets passed forward. So I wonder what kind of consequences that's going to show up in future generations where you have people who's going to graduate not knowing what failure is. And when they get into the corporate world, as you mentioned, some of these boys turn into men. And now when they want to be leaders of their own home and they start to fail, I wonder what's going to happen to them.
Oh, yeah, we already know what's going to happen to them because there's lots of study that's been done on this, is they have a tough time being resilient in life. And so this is one of the biggest things that they talk about is you got to let your children fail. You got to let your children make mistakes as kids and fail and put their own effort into it. And that's the most important thing. I think fundamentally for us as parents, as fathers, if we're talking about men in particular, we have a number of roles in life, right? One is to love our children, be present with our children, protect our children, right? Provide for our children. But the other one, and then be role models for our children. But the other one, the most important thing outside of the love is to teach and train our children to be successful, healthy, right? And good contributors to society. When I talk about successful, I'm not talking about money. That's just one aspect. I'm talking about being successful in a relationship, being successful in terms of being resilient, being able to deal with the challenges of life. And I can tell you hands down right now that men are having a tough time doing that because they've been babied, they've been entitled. This next generation is completely in that realm right now. I'm just going to use a prime example. My son's in that realm. And I've had very tough conversations to say, my son, he's getting entitled. We need to teach him resilience. We need to teach him that he has to earn the stuff. It's not just the Amazon days where you buy something and it comes the next day, right? That's how kids think things are these days. And that's not the real world when you're out there as an adult. No one is going to do that for you, especially as men. You're going to have to do that for yourself. So there's an interesting example where my son, so he's 11 years old. He has this thing for sitting in the front seat. Legally, you have to be 12 years old, right? And a certain weight. And I've let him sit in the front seat here and there, just close trips and side roads. And he said to me the other day, last week, he said, "You know what? When I get 12 years old, Dad, I'm going to sit in the front while Mama's driving, and you're going to sit in the back." And I sat there for a second. Part of me was just like, as an understanding father, I was like, okay. But then I had to go back and say, what am I teaching my son? Because why does my son get to sit in the front seat as, and because there's a level of dominance here that we have to take a look at as well, right? Because he's playing his card. He's playing his dominance card because he's saying, you are going to. He's not saying, can I? So that was really interesting for me. So at the beginning, my initial gut reaction was actually, that's nothing wrong with that because I was justifying. And then I was like, no, hold on. This kid has to earn it. And first of all, why does he get to sit in that seat thinking that he's more dominant than I am? And so I sat with him and I said, son, you got to earn sitting in the front seat. How are you going to do that? What is it that, why do you have the privilege of sitting in the front seat? And so that was a debate that actually started. But that's how the next generation is being raised, where it's like, I get to take this role, or I get this position, or I get whatever it is just because I've asked for it, or I've said I'm going to have it. So this is, as fathers, I'm seeing more and more of this. And it's a tough one because sometimes we have to, and this is where we've been, I'm going to say, not tricked, but how do I say it? It's almost like a misteaching for us men, whether it's directly or indirectly, that being a good father means being lenient and allowing your children to certain things and not bringing in the conversation about hierarchy or dominance or earning and stuff like that because that's masculine. You can't do that, right? Right? You gotta be kind with your kids and you gotta nurture them and be emotional. Yeah, we gotta do that kind of stuff, but they still have to earn it. They still have to understand there is a hierarchy in a home. It's psychologically shown that every system of a group of people, there is a social hierarchy, and that is a healthy thing for the unit. And there's a social hierarchy within a family. And that doesn't mean my son at 11 years old gets to circumvent me in a position without having to earn it. So I said, son, you're going to have to earn your own spot in your own family to sit in the front seat. Yeah, you may be able to sit in it every once in a while, but you're not going to tell me that you're going to sit in it. So that was just a story that I think is a real practical example of how kids are being raised these days.
So as we close, Pradeep, and you touched on earning it, give some of the men out there some tips on how they can earn their place in the world today.
Wow. Yeah, okay. So first of all, I think we need to step up as leaders. So earning it means being a leader, not necessarily a follower. One of the things that I think is very important for us to do is when we see poor leadership in other men, and we're seeing this a lot in the US, in the US political system, we have to stand up to it, right? That's the first thing. We have to stand up to things like injustice. We have to stand up for things like bullying, not being told. I see so many guys in social media getting caught up in this chitter chatter. It's like, you said this, you said that. Get out of that. That's not a masculine trait. Get out of that world. Be a leader. So that's the first thing. Be a leader in terms of that perspective. I'm going to say, get in tune with your physical self. That's the other part, right? Work on yourself. Be physically active or physically fit. Be emotionally, you can say, in tune with yourself. So that's the other part. I think this is the one thing that we can improve on a lot as men is the emotional connection with ourselves. And that's, I think that for us is an important part of earning it. Because if you're a emotionally in tune man who is in touch with his masculinity, you become extremely powerful because now you know, right? Now you know the emotional side of it, and you know that no one can BS you around. And I think that's the one. When men are emotionally insecure, that's when we become susceptible to all of this masculinity is bad for you. So being a good leader, I'm going to say if you're a family man, being the best family man that you can be is another one. If, if there's one thing that we can change as men in society, is being the best family men as we can. Because I think if we can do that, be the best leaders in our family, be the best family men, best husbands, best fathers, I think we can shift this. I think we definitely can shift this because we can band together stronger family units and stronger communities. I'm going to use a prime example. Uh, the guys that I know that have strong family units that are also in a social circle with strong family units, they tend to thrive. They tend to be the ones that thrive. So that's the pattern that I'm seeing. And so going back to your question about how do they earn it, I'm going to say be better leaders in the most important aspects of their lives.